Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our showing of Cape Fear, 1962, the first selection in our latest miniseries, Hollywood Villains We Love to Hate, which shines a spotlight on four of Hollywood's most evil villains. Evil and villainy, by their very nature, may lead to violence, gore, foul language, and other distasteful imagery. This is reflected in the fact that all four of the current films earned R ratings. R ratings are given for many reasons, some for milder imagery and some for much more disturbing scenes, and you can observe that too in these selections. We've chosen these four films very carefully because they depict some of the most famous of Hollywood's villains, and it will be up to you, the viewer, to decide which of them you're comfortable with. This version of Cape Fear is the original black and white one, directed by J. Lee Thompson, who felt that color would weaken the bleak, ominous atmosphere of the movie. It starred Robert Mitchum as the consummate villain, Cady, Gregory Peck as the lawyer, Bowden, and Martin Balsam as the policeman, Dutton. The screenplay was adopted by James R. Webb from John MacDonald's 1957 novel, The Executioners. At the time Cape Fear was made, it was common for major stars to have their own production companies, and Peck's and Mitchum's companies teamed up to obtain the film rights. Peck chose the title of the film because he thought the novel's title was a downer and would discourage filmgoers from viewing the movie. He observed that movies named after different places were generally financially successful. So he sat down with a map of the United States and scanned it until he came upon Cape Fear, North Carolina, near Wilmington, and decided that the imagery of the name was consistent with the small town settings in the book and the proposed tone of the movie. Thus was the title born. A second color version was made by Martin Scorsese in 1991, starring Robert De Niro as Cady and Nick Nolte as his lawyer, and featured Peck, Mitchum, and Balsam in roles different from those they had played in the original. The Bernard Herrmann score used for the first movie had become so famous in the period between the making of the two films that Scorsese reused it almost completely intact, with some adjustments made by another Hollywood composer, Elmer Bernstein. This original film is less violent than the later one because the censors worked diligently to reduce the violence. It relies more on illusion and implication rather than graphic imagery to protect its story. If you'd like to see De Niro's brilliant but more terrifying interpretation of the role of Cady, Cape Fear, 1991, is readily available on common streaming services and in public libraries. Peck had always admired Alfred Hitchcock and conceived that this film would be an homage to Hitchcock's style. He included some of Hitch's signature elements, such as unusual lighting angles, allowing the audience to know while the protagonist does not know what is going on, using an eerie musical score, plentiful close-ups, and very subtle hints of the violence Cady has planned for the family. Peck hired Hitchcock's production designer and film editor for this film. Herrmann complimented Thompson on the film because he had worked with Hitchcock and tried to create a Hitch-like score for the film. Herrmann, as he often did in his scores, used a reduced version of a symphony orchestra with a 46-piece string section accompanied by several wind instruments, but there's no percussion section. The score famously reinforces Cape Fear's savagery, and its use of dissonant string combinations suggests the workings of a killer's mind. Cape Fear received positive but cautious feedback from the critics. Rotten Tomatoes website says Cape Fear is an exemplary thriller, powered by Robert Mitchum's chilling performance and Bernard Herrmann's sinister score, and seethes with perfectly modulated tension. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times praised the tough, tight script, as well as the film's steady and starkly sinister style. In 2007, Newsweek chose Cady as one of the 100 best villains in movie history. But the film was a box office flop, and its failure ultimately bankrupted Peck's production company. A large part of the filming took place in Savannah, Georgia, which Mitchum despised because many years earlier, as a teenager, he had been charged with vagrancy and had been put up on a chain gang there. Other filming occurred in Fort Lauderdale and Hollywood, Florida, Stockton, California, and on the Universal backlot in Universal City, California. Several outdoor scenes were shot at Ladd's Marina in Stockton, including the culminating conflict inside the houseboat at the end of the film. Peck was well aware that Mitchum had the more important role in Cape Fear, but he agreed to let Mitchum run with his interpretation of Katie. Thompson, the director, worked hard to balance the roles of Katie and Bowden. The two actors were contrasting personalities. Peck always prepared meticulously for his roles, while Mitchum only learned his lines just before filming a scene, because he had a fantastic photographic memory. Plot summary. Small-town lawyer Sam Bowden's life becomes a nightmare when ex-con Max Cady enters his world. Katie was sent to jail when Bowden testified that Katie had attacked a young woman. Now that Katie has been released, he begins to terrorize Bowden and his family, particularly targeting Bowden's young daughter, Nancy. Initially, he uses his knowledge of the law that he acquired while he was incarcerated to annoy the Bowdens, but he moves on to killing the family dog and keeps on escalating his violent attacks. All of the Bowdens are fair game. So who will be the next subject of Katie's revenge? Fun facts about the film. During the river fight scene, Peck and Mitchum wore rubber suits under their clothes to keep them dry. When Mitchum held Peck's head underwater, Peck would tap him on the leg when he was running out of breath so that Mitchum could let him come up for air. Thompson was continually mollifying the censors, who were concerned about the violence displayed. The drowning scene had to be shortened to satisfy them, requiring the crew to reshoot some shots of Mitchum, whose look was far too lascivious for their delicate sensitivities. Mitchum was at first reluctant to play the role of Katie, but was persuaded to do so after Thompson and Peck sent a bunch of flowers and a case of bourbon to his home. He said, "Okay, I've drunk your bourbon, I'm drunk, I'll do it." The scene in which Katie attacks Polly Bergen's character in the houseboat was almost completely improvised. Before the scene was filmed, Thompson had a crew member bring him a dish of eggs. When the audience sees Mitchum rubbing the eggs on Bergen's chest, her reactions were completely genuine. Bergen later said that she hurt her back during the shooting of this scene because Mitchum was supposed to drag her through some nearby doors, but a crew member had mistakenly left them all locked. So in effect, her body was being used as a battering ram. Mitchum, for his part, cut his hand on a nearby cabinet shooting this scene, leading Bergen to recall that, quote, "his hand was covered in blood and my back was covered in blood. We just kept going, caught up in the scene. They came over and physically stopped us." In the novel, Katie was a soldier who had been court-martialed and convicted on Bowden's testimony for the rape of a 14-year-old girl. The censors banned the word rape and forbade the depiction of Katie as a soldier because it reflected badly on U.S. military personnel. Thompson constantly complained about the censors. He argued that the UK censor, John Trevelyan, had ruined the film by making extensive cuts and edits. Trevelyan, for his part, claimed that he had made only 15 cuts and had edited threatening dialogue and assault references. Katie's attack on Peggy Bowden, and all shots of Katie staring longingly at Nancy. Ultimately, all of his cuts and edits were restored for later releases. In the scene of the police precinct, the cops listed on the duty roster are the characters from the 87th Precinct series of novels by Evan Hunter. Mitchum claimed that during his fight scene with Peck actually punched him for real, but he knew that the punch was accidental, so he didn't break character and kept filming. When he entered his trailer after the shot was completed, he literally collapsed due to the effect of the punch, It felt its effects for days afterwards. He said, "I don't feel sorry for anyone dumb enough to pick a fight with him." The hotel where Katie takes the prostitute, Barry Chase, is Mother's house from Psycho, 1960. Things to look for. Scenes of Savannah under the opening credits. The fight scene in the river. Bernard Herrmann's ominous, frightening score, including his use of wind instruments without any percussion. Look for the brass active American sculpture in the interior of the houseboat. Look for Hitchcock-like photo tricks, such as odd camera angles, the storm scene at the end, the scene in which Katie smears the eggs on Polly Bergen's chest, the ominous quality of the black and white atmosphere, Katie's use of legal technicalities to defend his actions, the duty roster in the police precinct scene, and the use of Mother's house from Psycho. Now it's time to view Cape Fear. Sit back, settle down. Please remember that it may take a few minutes for the film to roll. Enjoy.